Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Croft. I'm one of the academic advisors for the National Institute of Oral Health. We had a discussion last night regarding essays, and unfortunately what happened, the transcripts and the recordings were somehow discarded on the system. So I've re-recorded many of the highlights from last night's call. I think we'll be able to have the similar discussion as we had last night, but you'll also have notes to follow along with, which will be very helpful. Just as an introduction to who I am and of course who Teresa is, both of us graduated from the Institute, and some of you may have Teresa as an advisor, some may have me, and some may have Maddie. We've all been involved in the program, various different levels. I've been involved in it since 2006 and Teresa since 2008. And I'm not sure exactly when Maddie was first started with the program, but we've all been academic advisors since 2009. So our goal and our plan is to facilitate your journey through the process, and this is one way we can accomplish that. As I go through this presentation, I may stop out and go back to the website at the NIWH just to show you a few new items that we have in store for you. For example, each month we'll be putting out a basic, simple one-page newsletter giving you updates and highlights of things that may be changing or just things that we need to communicate to you. We'll also be adding, and we have already added, a forum for discussion, a frequently asked questions section, as well as an advisor call form schedule. Right now what I'll do is I'll go out to the website and I'll show you what that looks like. When you're at the website, you'll see this, and at the required reading NIWH study guide, if you click on that, you'll see all the areas that I'm talking about. So the student forum was added last night after our discussion. This is where you can pose questions and discuss things with other students. The frequently asked questions, of course, are things that students simply have questions about. And this is the first stop that you should make anytime you have a question, because it may be answered here. If you happen to come up with a question that we don't have on there, we'll certainly include it at a later date. The other thing is the advisor call form. I'm going to click on that. These are our call topics that we have, and tonight's topic is using essay assignments feedback to enhance your experience in the program. There's always room for improvement. A discussion will help you maximize the benefits of your academic advisor's feedback so you can take your work and practice to the next level. So that's what we'll begin with tonight. One of the first items that Maddie wanted me to cover with you, since she was originally going to facilitate this discussion, was the word count. Ultimately, 1,500 words is the minimum word count. That's 1,000 words for the objectives and 500 words for the application section. We'll discuss more about the application section later, but for right now, when you answer your objectives, you should strike for around 1,000 words. Keep in mind that the template actually has 200 words when you begin. So if you will take and add 1,500 to 200, you'll get 1,700 at the end, and that's what we're really looking for. If you're 100 off here or there, we're not going to send it back to you. We'll just simply remind you that you need to bump the word count up a bit. A lot of students don't quite see that there's a word count when they first start. So the first thing you should do before you even type anything into the template is to check the word count on the template and add 1,500 words so you can make sure that you know where you are at the completion. The problem is that we have a standard that we must meet in order to ensure that you meet our requirements. 1,000 words for the objectives and then 500 for the application essay. The maximum word count is 2,500 words. Again, the maximum is 2,500 words. So in theory, you could have 1,250 for the outline objectives and then 1,250 for the application if you choose to. You could have 1,000 for the objectives and 1,500 for the application. We just want you to keep it under 2,500, but at least 1,500. Another topic that we discussed was the fact that many objectives will either say list, discuss, or describe. In this case, make sure you read, because sometimes it says list and discuss or list and describe. So make sure that you pay attention to that so when you do answer the question, you answer them completely. These objectives will be used to study for your final exam. So make sure that you keep a folder with these templates in there so you can refer back to them. In fact, what I would recommend, what was helpful to me, is I created 5 folders, one folder for each aspect. And so what I would do is I would collect information as I would move through the essays, and if it applied to the emotional content, I would shove it into my emotional folder. And if it's physical, into the physical. This way, when I went to go do my research, I had the items that I needed in the particular folders. Now, students are generally great about answering their learning objectives correctly. There are occasions when they don't, and I or the other advisors will do is to clarify in our responses. Now, keep in mind, we're trying to sort of guide you and help you along the way. So that's the purpose of those learning objectives. For example, this is an example from, I think, one of Maddie's responses. She may have said, learning objective 5, describe the various metabolic ways in which the diet affects the heart disease. It's important to highlight the fact that too much sodium in the diet raises fluid retention and corresponding blood pressure. Another vital point is that you discuss extensively in your application is the issue of nutrition. A poor diet, high in saturated fat or carbohydrates, yields overfilled cells, increases triglycerides with insulin resistance and potential artery lining buildup, which can lead to thrombic incident during stress. In learning objective 6, it is essential to note that the significance of not smoking in disease prevention, again, helping people understand the how and the why in simple terms, empowers them to connect the dots and make well-formed and healthier choices. So this is a sample response that Maddie may have provided a student. And these things are just, in my case, what I would do is something very similar. I would provide a response in order to prompt a student to think a little deeper with the information. And when providing a response, you should keep in mind that the objectives should apply to the content of the course, and you should use the corresponding reading within that course. Going outside onto the internet is really not part of the program. You should build the information from within the program. But that does mean you can also fall back on previous information learned and pull that into your objectives and essays as well. So for example, inflammation and disease is the first course you take. When you get to nutrition and diet, or brain function and nutrition, or any of those courses, you can certainly pull out of those courses, previous courses, information that you feel would be helpful, because this is an integrated program. So we're trying to ensure that you constantly go back and maybe look at, well, how does inflammation and disease that Barry Sears talked about would be helpful here. And there's a lot of good information with that silent information as it applies particularly to brain health, to digestive health, for that matter, whole health. Speaking of those aspects, we generally want to make sure that you focus on the 5 aspects. The first 3 courses you take, number 1 is inflammation and disease, number 2 is mindful listening, and number 3 is physics and philosophy. Once you get to physics and philosophy, the 5 aspects is brought into focus. What we would like for you to do at that point is to start focusing each essay with those 5 aspects in mind. Even if it's on nutrition, you should always reference those other 4 aspects, because certainly nutrition affects the physical, it affects the emotional and spiritual, and nutrition itself is affected by the environment. Our digestive process is affected by the environment. So those things are very important to include with each and every essay after physics and philosophy. So keep that in mind. So we're trying to validate what you're doing, but also apply it to the 5 elements. So for my students, sometimes what will happen is they'll include 2 or 3 of the elements, and I will prompt them by saying something to the effect, keep in mind that the other elements such as emotional and spiritual also should be considered, and this is how. Again, just to prompt you to think about that in the next essay. So when you're reading through the essays, make sure that if you haven't included something, to make sure you start including it moving forward. You'll continuously get those prompts because by the end of the curriculum, we want you to constantly be thinking about addressing the patient from 5 aspects as we step around that patient to determine their cause of their condition or the solution to their cause of that condition. This may seem redundant at times, but keep in mind, if we constantly are doing this, we won't leave anything out. And you'll find out when you work with clients for the first time, if you haven't already done so, that this is invaluable, because once they understand that you care, then they'll really listen. And when you constantly go back and refer back to these various different aspects, you start to focus and get a clear picture of what the real underlying issue is. Now, once you get past physics and philosophy, it is important to realize that we will all become more specific. All the advisors become more specific about information, what you can do to improve your assignment. We have different takes on how to do that. So if it doesn't come to fruition, sometimes we become a little bit more direct. At the beginning, it's sort of not as direct, but it becomes even more specific and even more deliberate and even more direct if you're not coming up to speed with those 5 aspects. So keep in mind, moving forward, past physics and philosophy, you want to really focus on those 5 aspects. I think it's extremely important. In addition, the application essay, as we get into those 5 aspects, should also be included. Again, when you think about how you're going to apply it to a client, think all 5 aspects. How would you address each one? Now, of course, if the application essay is on digestion, and you might think, well, the essay itself should be just on digestion. The application essay is not a reiteration of the objectives. The application is specifically designed for us to see how you're going to use the information. It's extremely important that you reflect on the information you learned, as well as reflecting on information you learned in previous courses, to answer the questions such as, how would you apply it to yourself or to a client? How would the session look? What would it look like to you, look like to the client? How might it unfold? Certainly, it won't take much to add up to 500 words if you really focus on these things. Now, what the application essay does, it says, how would you apply this to a patient, client, or to yourself? But add to that one question and say, how would you apply it to yourself? How would it look like? How would it unfold? And given the fact that we're talking about the 5 aspects, how would we address the physical, environmental, emotional, spiritual, and nutritional? Obviously, if the course is on nutrition, you might emphasize more on nutrition for that particular essay, but you should always pull back in, how does that nutritional aspect affect the physical? How is the environment affecting the ability to digest the food? Is it affecting a patient? And then, of course, how does that influence a patient's emotions? And ultimately, their essence or their spirit. How does that affect them spiritually? Now, a lot of people may or may not have a client base. If you aren't working with a client base, keep in mind that you're making up or conjuring, if you will, this whole scenario in your head. If you have a client base, it's very easy because you already have something to kind of draw from that maybe you could use as an example of a client or a patient that you might have worked with. For those of you that don't have a client or a patient base, keep in mind that it's not that hard to sort of create a scenario of what you think, maybe by reflecting on maybe a family member, or a friend, or someone else who's come to you for had questions. What is their situation? And again, no names, but just describe the person. What is their main concern, and what kind of things might you address with that patient, again, our client, at the 5 aspect level. The key to application essays is to make them succinct as possible. Practicing the system of the 5 aspects, keeping the information succinct, reflecting back on the previous information will be very helpful to you. It's essential to pull that information from those previous courses. It won't take much to add up to 500 words. And keep in mind, you have up to 2,500 words that you can address your concerns. So you could take 1,000 words to the objectives and 1,500 words to the application essay. Many people like the application essay because it really gets them their ability, that really kind of helps them flex their intellectual muscles, and it really turns them on. If you don't have a client base, you've never worked with one, again, it shouldn't take much to get to 500 words. Doing this repeatedly in 500 words will help you on the final exam, the final paper, and especially when you're working in a clinical or other setting. When you become clear and succinct about what you're saying, you're conveying critical information to others without complicating it. It's really about simplifying and demystifying. That's what the whole health education process is about. Stop and think, do I really need to provide this type of information to a client or to another person? How can I get to the essential elements? One of the things you'll learn during your externship is how to create pictures to address things with clients. As they say, a picture paints 1,000 words. And oftentimes what will happen is people get so fixated on the words that they don't really see the meaning behind the words. So we use handouts, one-page handouts, maybe with a picture of the digestive system or a picture of the brain, or maybe a graphic design designed to sort of stimulate the person to think about how all this fits together. This really helps solidify in the person's psyche how this stuff works, and they become empowered when they are able to learn about it without complicating it with a lot of words. Now, in your objectives, of course, you are going to have to describe it in words, and the whole purpose of that is to ensure that you learn how to write it out in a clear, concise, succinct, simplified manner. So practice makes perfect. We want you to do well, and we want you to do well as a whole health educator or coach. So make sure you constantly are thinking of how you can make that more clear, succinct, and demystified. As we were going through last night, we had a number of questions. These questions came up throughout the session, and they were interspersed during the original recording. Because we are at the towards the end of the information, I decided to put the questions from students here. Now, the first question, I believe, came from April, and it says, are the handouts separate from the reading? I did not see a separate download. I just started the course. All right, so when you go on to the course, you'll find that you'll have the template, and with the template that comes up, it'll have the objectives to the right in the center column, and to the right of that center column are the reading assignments. Sometimes you have handouts, and those handouts would be included in that PDF. Sometimes you have required or you have recommended reading. The required reading is mandatory that you buy the book. The recommended reading is it's your choice. The great news is that many of these books can be purchased via ebook. So keep in mind that your ebook purchases make it much easier to help you find information. But also keep in mind that it's important that you do read even the recommended reading. Most people think, well, I don't have to buy the recommended reading because it's just recommended. But if you don't have the background, it's really important. And a great example that we used last night were molecules of emotion. This is one of the more difficult concepts to grasp, and Candace Pertz, Dr. Pertz's book, does a wonderful job of explaining and demystifying the information. Students who read it do really well on that essay. Students who don't read it really struggle with that essay. And so we just want to make sure that even though it says recommended, depending on your background will depend on whether you should purchase it. I think recommended reading for molecules of emotion should be in your mind a required reading. In fact, all of the books. Last night, Teresa and I discussed this with the students, and we all agreed that buying even the recommended readings would, at least if nothing else, give you that base of information that you may have not had by avoiding purchasing the book. Ebook prices are much cheaper than standard book prices, so that will also help in reducing the cost. The assignments, the second question, I can't remember who that came from, this was the question. Assignments, are they to be used at the end of the course for test and certification preparation? And the answer is yes. That's a great question, because you're working on those objectives, and what are you going to do with them at the end? You're going to use them to answer questions on the final exam. The final exam is the step after you complete all the courses and before you begin your externship. So you have the courses, the test. Following the test, you begin your externship. It's a 6-week externship followed by a final paper. The final certification process involves all of those things. So the certification involves completion of the courses, completion of the test, completion of the externship, and completion of the final paper and approval from the Institute. This is a rigorous program from that perspective, and there are no other programs that offer this level of requirement for you to achieve that certification, but you will be well prepared if you do. Being well prepared means answering those essays, answering those objectives as clearly and succinctly as you can. It'll make your test go by so much easier. And again, recommended that you study those questions as you go along. It will help sort of solidify that information in your repertoire. So keep in mind, study the objectives. It's real important. The last question I think also came from April. Since I just started, I would like clarification on the learning objectives. Everything I write is meant to be understood by a client. I'm not providing academic-based answers in learning objectives. Well, this one is a little more complicated because let me just start with the application essay. Yes, the application essay is meant to be understood by a client. With that said, so are the objectives. As an educator, I'm guilty of, and I work in a healthcare environment. I get excited when I see those technical explanations and academic-based answers. But as Teresa and I were discussing with the students last night, you can take that information and make it more understandable. And to be quite honest with you, if a student gives me an academic-based answer, I am certainly not going to tell them they need to rewrite the paper by any stretch of the imagination. What I am going to say, though, is to keep in mind that when discussing this with clients, how would you explain it? And the great place to do that would be in your application essay. So if a student gets really heady with the information and the objectives, which quite honestly the objectives do sort of lend itself better to that, I will prompt them in the next essay to make sure that they clarify that in the application essay. How would you explain that to a client? So it's okay if you do give an academic-based answer, but you do want to simplify it as much as you possibly can. Again, you're not dumbing down the information. You're simply putting it in words that a client could understand it. One example we used last night was, what about the digestive course? Because that one's really, and as well as the brain and brain and behavior course. How in the world can you get those technical terms down to a simplified version? Well, you can't avoid the fact they are called what they are called, and the words are anatomy-based questions that come from Latin in many cases. And those you can't change what they are. But what we're talking about is how would you, after you explain it, maybe given a definition of what it is, or given a definition of that word. This way, if you're talking about the amygdala, for example, in the brain health and nutrition course, you would describe what the amygdala is briefly. This way, we would understand that if you use that term, you would also define it for a client. When you have to use those academic-based terms, you also, when you can't avoid them, obviously, you have to explain what that is. So that would be the time to provide a little bit more information about, if you're going to call something by its technical term, here's what this means. And the meaning of it could be simplified for a client's understanding. It's very easy to do. In particular, when you get into your externship, that's where you really hone the skills of being able to simplify the information to make it utilized by a client much more easily. Keep in mind that you're going to be conveying this information to a client eventually. So the better you get at conveying that information, the better off you'll be at the end. Your clients will be better off. Compliance with their plan will be better. So hopefully this has helped. I wish everyone could have been on the call last night, but we did have quite a few, and it was a great experience. The students, I think, got a lot out of it, and we hope to see you in next month's call. Keep in mind the calls are posted online, and this particular call will be posted for you to listen, and you are listening at the moment, so hopefully you will have an opportunity to review the information and some of the thoughts that we had from last night. Again, I do apologize for not having the original recording, but I think we covered the highlights. Thank you for attending this particular distance learning version of our call from October 15th. Thank you very much.